Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH CORE. Welcome to our webinar on the Phase 5 Prior Authorization Operating Rules. I'd like to mention a few logistical items. A copy of the slides and the webinar recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. Also, we will have time at the end of today's program to respond to your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. We have a lot to cover during this call. We'll start off with an overview of the approach CAQH CORE has taken to help address the prior authorization challenge. We will then talk about the operating rule requirements and do a deep dive on the rules for data content and web portals. After that, we will move on to the Phase 5 certification test suite and finish off with next steps and implementation resources. I'd like to thank our guest speakers, in particular, Noam Nahari from Montefiore Medical Center and Rhonda Starkey from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Thank you so much for being here today. And now let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, CAQH CORE Director, Robert Bowman. Bob?
Great, thank you, Jessica. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see that what we've tried to do is encapsulate some of the challenges that the industry faces with prior authorization. Now, PA has been long used as a utilization tool to help adjudicate people, time, resources, dollars, funding for healthcare, but it does require providers to make a request to the health plan to evaluate that request and adjudicate it, and reply to the provider with exactly what the requirements are for a particular service or drug or recommendation to the provider on what type of care should be provided to a particular member. A lot of this is very inefficient, as one can imagine. With nearly 200 million transactions being conducted every year, many of those transactions, actually about 87% of them, are manual or partially manual. It's phone, fax, email, web portals, IVR systems, with only about 12% of them using the HIPAA standard transaction for prior authorization today. So this requires a lot of manual effort for the provider as well as for the health plan to make those determinations. Another significant burden is that the PA process is siloed, right? It's independent of an eligibility verification, it's independent of a healthcare claim transaction, and therefore oftentimes the delays, the differences in adjudication cycles between a PA and a claim can have direct impact to the provider and to the member. So it does impact both the patient care as well as the provider administrative functions that take place in the provider office. Not only that, there are often really timely delays in the return of the response that's provided to the provider. So it takes a long time for the provider to make that determination, then be able to schedule care and, again, directly impacting that care. We know from the index there is potential savings of millions and millions of dollars if we can better automate that process for PA delivery, and also ultimately then expedite delivery of care for the member, or again to even highlight other options of care for the member. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we do have a very particular vision here at CAQH CORE with how we envision prior authorization. We see that prior authorization, we want to impart through our consensus-driven approach very key types of requirements, put those into the environment, into the industry, have the industry through an iterative process implement those requirements within their systems, within their applications, within their business processes to help automate really from this almost completely manual process that PA is in today to a more optimized process that is fully automated. We know that will take time, and so we've started that process with our Phase 4 operating rules, which really just laid the foundational infrastructure requirements for system connectivity, for security, for acknowledgments to ensure that transactions can flow in the most appropriate way. Now, phase 5, which we'll hear more about this afternoon, we address the needed data content requirements for the 278 transaction, both how the provider submits it as well as how the health plan responds, with what data the health plan responds, as well as ensuring that there's greater consistency between the different types of exchange models that exist today. So web portals being one of those cases. We're continuing our work, and we'll hear more about that also this afternoon, with different pilots that we're going to be conducting this year, as well as looking at other types of requirements that the industry can address through our discussions and our consensus-based approach. If we look on the next slide, you can kind of see our time frames and what we're looking at as our roadmap. You can see through phase 4, we completed that. We've conducted an environmental scan. We've launched phase 5 into the industry. We're going to continue this year and into next looking at the phase 4 response time update. Again, more detail coming on that. But we're looking at how we can adjust those requirements to make the transaction and the business process more efficient for providers and health plans. Along with pilots, different requirements, both phase 4, phase 5, and additionally new requirements for different types of PA supporting transactions, like is a PA required for this particular service or not. We're also looking at updating our connectivity rule to ensure that it meets the industry needs, and as the industry looks at other modes and mechanisms for connectivity and security, that's going to be an important factor for us as well. Looking into the future, we're also going to be looking at applying these additional requirements that come out of our pilot testing this year into potential future rule options and requirements, as well as looking at how other types of transactions like attachments and other types of models like value-based payment models impact this process. Obviously, attachments, VBP, and prior authorization, there's lots of discussion in the industry, and we want to make sure that any rules that we put into the marketplace for consumption really meet the business need, and they have that very specific ROI has been collected. We can respond to those types of needs by the industry. On the next slide, you'll see that we do have a very systematic approach to the way that we develop our operating rules. This has been the case since day one, 12 years ago, and we're going to continue this model. But we want to share with you, the broader industry, that we do have a very specific model. We do use our participants through this process, and again, our participants are all volunteers. They come to the table, they sit at that round table, and we look and see where the industry's at. We tackle those very specific challenges, often with an advisory group. We launched a PA advisory group to start this process. We then have a rules work group, a technical work group. We have subgroups that work on different components, and we use very specific mechanisms like straw polls and surveys and discussion on our calls. Again, they're all call-based, so anyone in the country can participate. And we have those types of discussions that CAQH CORE staff facilitate and move the industry towards consensus. And then we go through an approval process, a voting process by our organizations that really require them to understand the requirements, what the impact of those requirements are, and then have them actually vote, up and down votes and ballots for the rule packages. And for this particular rule package, we had nearly a 90% approval rating for the phase 5 rule set, which is very, very high. As you can imagine, the industry coming together in consensus with the different stakeholder groups, and this includes both health plans, providers, vendors, and clearinghouses, and different associations that have all come together to host these conversations, to tackle these issues in a systematic way and in a consensus-based way. On our next slide, you'll see that some of the actual points that our participants came together on, both between phase 4 and phase 5 together, trying to tackle some of these problems, these particular pain points. I think a very symptomatic scheme of the PA process between part A, B, and C, between requesting, submitting, and getting the approval, we try to ensure that our operating rules tackle some of those key pain points, everything from consistent patient identification to standard companion guides for what the transaction should look like as it comes into the health plan, to very specific types of requirements for example, a vendor or a clearinghouse or a health plan. System availability, the system has to be able to receive the transaction and adjudicate that transaction. There has to be ways to display code description. So a provider just doesn't get a code AC, they may not know what AC means or stay under what the next step is in that process just by getting an AC indicator. Right, so we displaying that code description definition allows the provider to make the next business step in a much more systematic and consistent way. Again, it's going to be very important to have connectivity and security as well for the transactions. This is oftentimes some very important patient information, provider information that's being transmitted from point A to point B. We also tackle that within our operating rules. Again, between the infrastructure and the data content, we're trying to make a unified approach to the way that the transaction is conducted, the data that's within the transaction, and ensuring that the next steps are known for the provider and what they need to do to ensure, again, that we have consistent coverage. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to start our discussion of the more detailed rule requirements here for the Phase 5 rule sets. Again, we want to provide you with the details for the rules. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that really this is just our timeline for how we've approached the rules. And I'm sorry, we wanted to level set with the operating rules. Again, we had that 90% approval rating. There's 2 rules within the rule set. The rule set includes both a data content rule, as I mentioned, again, looking at the process for the request for medical services, very specific use case when those types of requests are pended due to missing or incomplete information, primarily because the medical necessity information is missing from the transaction or from the case. The health plan needs that information. The rule requirement does have very specific rule requirements for that use case. There are other types of requirements as well for the data content, again, both on the provider side and the health plan side. We'll go through some of that detail in just a moment. The second rule in the rule package also includes the prior authorization web portal rule. Again, this tries to build consistency and uniformity between how the different tools in the marketplace exist today to help the providers more consistently and more uniformly use these tools, because they are very common, they're very popular, but they're also very burdensome for providers. And so there are requirements addressing some of the data fields, ensuring confirmation of receipt of a transaction, as well as system availability. Again, very high level list of the requirements. We'll go into more detail in just a moment. On the next slide, we actually have the time frame and the timeline of how we've done things over the previous year to get to the final core vote. That vote, again, did pass at 90%. The core board completed their vote this month. Again, also very high levels of support from our core board. We're launching the rule set into the industry now and through the month of June with our list of resources and resources that will be available for you. Also, we'll talk about our core certification testing site that will be launched also this year. Again, it is available already for Phase 4, so you can go ahead and work on that now and get your connectivity and your security set up for the transactions. And then we'll work on Phase 5 this year so you can have your data content ready for the transaction support as well. Now, moving on to the next section of our presentation, I'd like to hand the call over to Rhonda, who also acted as a co-chair for us as we developed the rule set. So Rhonda, if you're available.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Bob said, Rhonda Starkey from Harvard Pilgrim, a co-chair of the Prior Authorization subgroup and the Rules Workgroup. On the next slide, we talk about the Phase 5 CAQH CORE Prior Authorization 278 Request Response Data Content Rule. And this rule targets one of the most significant problem areas in the prior authorization process, that is, requests for medical services that are pended due to missing or incomplete information, primarily medical necessity information. The rule requirements seek to reduce the unnecessary back and forth between providers and health plans enabling shorter adjudication timeframes and fewer staff resources spent on manual follow-up. Specific rule requirements that are included are, first, consistent patient identification and verification to reduce common errors and denials. Next, the return of specific AAA error codes and action codes when certain errors are detected on the request. Third, return of healthcare service decision reason codes to help provide the clearest explanation to the submitter of the decision. Use of the PWK01 code or use of the logical identifiers, names, and codes with a PWK01 code to again provide clearer direction on status and what is needed for adjudication. And lastly, detection and display of all code descriptions to reduce the burden of interpretation. If you look at the bottom of the slide, we're going to talk about what's in scope. This prior authorization 278 data rule content applies to the 5010 X217 278 request response transactions for prior authorizations for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, devices, supplies, or medications within the medical benefit. This rule applies when any HIPAA-covered entity and its agent uses, conducts, or processes that transaction. As many of you know, there are many business events that this transaction supports. So what we want to do is highlight a few of the business events supported by the 278 transaction that these data rule contents do not apply to. And the first is referrals are not included in the scope. Because the focus of the data content rule is truly to mitigate the pain points for prior authorization requests for medical services that are pended due to the need to prove medical necessity. Many surveys revealed this use case as one of the most common reasons for pens and denials, while the environmental scan and subsequent subgroup and workgroup polling consistently did not find referral requests to be routinely delayed. Next, emergency and urgent requests are out of scope, and that is because the ACA prohibits requirements for prior authorization to access emergency services. And finally, the rule does not apply to prior authorizations for retail pharmacy services and medications, given that the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs covers these standards and operating rules. These are therefore not addressed in the CAQH CORE operating rules. If we go to slide 16, we learned in extensive environmental scans that health plans most often pend or deny a prior authorization request due to missing, incomplete, or inaccurate information submitted on the request. Key example of this is patient information. To encourage more consistent and accurate submission of patient information, this requirement specifies the data field, which includes the loop and segment, in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is a subscriber, as well as the data field, again with loop and segment, in which a provider must submit identifying information if the patient is the dependent. When the health plan and its agent receive the request, they should normalize the patient last name. Normalizing applies to specific characters in a patient's name, including punctuation values, special characters, uppercase, lowercase, name suffixes, and prefixes. By requiring character strings to be removed during name normalization and recommending a set of punctuation values to be used to delimit last name from suffix or prefix, normalization promotes successful adjudication of information included on the request that is reviewed by health plans. On the bottom of the slide again, you'll see what is out of scope for this rule requirement. The requirement does not require core certified entities to internally store data elements, does not require the conversion of letter case and or special characters by any party for subsequent processing of the data through external systems. It does not specify whether the full last name or only a portion of the last name must be validated, and it does not specify the search criteria for the patient. We can move to slide 17. The data content rule requirements also address scenarios where the information included on a response does not provide sufficient detail to know why a request was pended and what information a health plan needs to resolve the pend. The rule requires that the health plan and its agent must return the appropriate HCR01 action code of A4, which is pended, as well as the appropriate HCR03 industry code, and then also include either the appropriate PWK01 attachment report type code or a logical observation identifiers names and codes, or LOINCs, and the appropriate PWK01 attachment report type code. This requirement enables providers to know what types of additional documentation are required by the health plan in order for their PA requests to be fully adjudicated. To encourage movement toward a more automated and streamlined processing of the request and flagging the need for additional documentation, the rule requirement also requires that the health plan process submitted diagnosis, procedure, and revenue codes that fall into types of services that are often pended for medical necessity. This will allow for the industry to make progress in building logic into adjudication systems for prior authorization. Categories of services included in the rule are included at the bottom of the slide. And I don't know if others, but I'm still on slide 16 in the presentation. Can we move to slide 17 so folks can see the bottom of the slide? It should be noted that this requirement uses the standard terms as used in the 278 Technical Report Type 3. The rule does not require providers to submit diagnosis or procedure codes. And now moving on to slide 18. The next bucket of requirements all fall under the umbrella of consistent use of codes to indicate errors, decisions, and next steps. Consistent and uniform use of the 888 error and action codes requires the return of the most specific AAA error and action codes in response when certain errors are detected in the request. Additionally, using healthcare service decision reason codes requires that a second healthcare service decision reason code be returned in the HCR segment, in addition to the required code, to send the most comprehensive information back to the provider. And finally, we can move to slide 19. The detection and display of the 278 response data elements requires the receiver of the 278 response to detect and extract all data elements, data element codes, and corresponding code definitions to which the rule applies in the 278 response. The rule also requires the receiver to display or otherwise make the data appropriately available to the end user without altering the semantic meaning of the 278 response data content. This will assist with easing the burden of interpretation of codes or provider staff so that they can understand next steps. And at this point, I'll hand the call to Noam, who'll walk us through the requirements of the Phase 5 Prior Authorization Web Portal Rule.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hi, this is Noam Nahari from Montefiore Medical Center. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Rules Work Group, and I'm going to be taking you through the next few slides. Just want to pause for a second. I think we're having some technical issues moving the slides along. Bob or Jessica, are we okay with the slides? Can we shift to slide 20, if
Yeah,
that's
give
all
me
right.
one. Oh, hey now, Miss Jessica, give me 1 second. I know I'm on slide 20, so let me just make sure. How does that,
There you
That
go.
looks, that looks
did
great.
that work?
Yeah,
Sorry about that, thank you.
thanks. So let's get started by reviewing what's in and out of scope for the web portal rule. Moving on to slide 21, hopefully. There we go. The Phase 5 CAQH CORE Prior Authorization Web Portal Rule builds a bridge towards overall consistency for referral and prior authorization requests and responses by addressing fundamental uniformity for data fields, ensuring confirmation of the receipt of a request, and providing for system availability. Specific rule requirements include use of the X12 5010 278 request response TR3 implementation names or alias names for the web portal data field labels to reduce variation, system availability requirements for a health plan to receive requests to enable predictability for providers, confirmation of receipt of request to reduce manual follow-up for providers, and adherence to the requirements outlined in the 278 request response data content rule when the portal operator maps the collected data from the web portal to the X12 5010 278 transactions. In terms of scope of this rule, the prior authorization web portal rule applies to any web portal used to submit a referral, as well as prior authorizations for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, devices, supplies, or medications within the medical benefit. The rule applies when any entity and its agent make available a web portal to a provider to submit a prior authorization request or referral. In terms of what is out of scope for the web portal rule, as with the data content rule, this rule does not apply to prior authorizations for retail pharmacy services and medications, as the NCPDP covers these standards and operating rules. Additionally, the rule does not require any entity to conduct, use, or process a prior authorization or referral via a web portal if it does not currently do so. Next slide. Okay, let's start off now with system availability and reporting requirements. The system availability requirements in the prior authorization web portal rule requires that the web portal be available no less than 86% per calendar week, consistent with availability requirements in prior phases for the standard transactions, including the 278. This allows for 24 hours per calendar week for regularly scheduled web portal downtime. In addition to system availability in general, health plans and their agents must make available their notices of scheduled downtime, holidays, and any non-routine downtime. In addition, they must provide information within 1 hour of emergency downtime and publish non-routine downtime at least 1 week in advance. During that downtime, web portals are not required to send a response to notify the provider that the web portal is down and where to submit a prior authorization request. However, the web portal operator should make available an alternative method of submission during the downtime if it's applicable. Next slide. Thank you. The prior authorization web portal rule also requires that health plans and vendors return a submission receipt to the provider indicating that the prior authorization form was successfully received and notifying the web portal operator of any next steps unless the system is down and therefore unavailable to process requests. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see examples of this receipt and next steps that could be returned to the web portal operator. Notification that the web portal operator requires additional documentation to process the request, an option to print and save as a PDF, view the prior authorization status, the status or an update of a previously submitted request, assignment of a transaction or reference control number, a detailed timestamp, potentially including date, time, and time zone of the submission. I'd like to note that the examples listed here on this slide do not represent an exhaustive list of what information could be returned to the web portal operator. However, these are only a few examples. In an effort to bring consistency and standardization to the web forms, the web portal rule requires the use of the 5010-278 response and request TR3 implementation names for the web portal data field labels on both the request form and the response. Another option is for entities to use the TR3 alias field name, which at times may be more recognizable to those operating the portal and submitting the form, while still within the standard TR3. In addition to ease understanding, the requirement notes that web portal operators may present supplemental information regarding the data fields via a mouse hover function or some similar functionality. Finally, the web portal rule requires that if a web portal operator maps the data collected from the web form to the X12 5010-278 request response transaction, it must conform with the Phase 5 CAQH CORE Prior Authorization 278 request response data content rule. I will now turn the call over to Bob to discuss the Phase 5 certification test suite.
Great, thanks, Noam. An important component of what the core participants do, besides writing the technical rule requirements, is also to develop a certification test suite. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that the process that we develop, it is an industry by industry developed testing process that allows for the four main stakeholder groups, again, health plans, providers, clearinghouses, and software vendors or application vendors, to ensure that their systems and applications and business processes all conform to the rule requirements. So this is a really broad way of ensuring that, it's a really broad way of developing an insurance program to make sure that everyone is, the roles and responsibilities are being met. CAQH CORE only serves as a neutral certification administrator. We don't actually conduct the testing. We just review the results of the testing that is being conducted with a third-party vendor that is an expert in EDI. On the next slide, you'll see that we have been quite successful since we've launched our program's inception with awarding 361 certification seals. We do like to thank our most recent certified entities there. You see the list between Security Health, Frontrunner, Trio Health, and Eligible. We have been trying to ensure that we're covering the market in a way that is consistent with how the industry has been developing and growing over the years. So you can see here we have about 78% of the covered lives for Phase 1 and 2 for eligibility and claim status transactions, 75% of the Medicare Advantage lives, for example, and pushing towards 50% for the Medicaid population for eligibility and claim status transactions. You can see the other representative examples there for Phase 3 certification. Now you'll start to see, as we track and trend, Phase 4 and Phase 5 transactions as well for our certifications. So again, a very robust program to ensure conformance and compliance with the operating rule. On the next slide, you'll see that we do have specific tools set up to ensure that each of those main stakeholder types can build the systems and applications and environments to ensure that they can meet the testing requirements. So we do publish a test suite. It does have various sections in it to help orient your staff, the folks that are going to be developing these systems and applications and ensuring that they can provide the correct data within the transactions and they go out according to the correct connectivity and security requirements. So again, it is quite robust. It is quite detailed. It is really meant for people that are in the weeds doing the work. We have a gap analysis tool. We have a certification test suite. We have a number of resources that help those individuals build these systems and applications to ensure that they can test accurately with that third-party vendor. Again, we do have two different test scenarios, one for data content and one for the web portal requirements, as we kind of detail those very specific requirements this afternoon. Again, we go into step-by-step test scripts addressing each one of these conformance requirements, so you know exactly what the expectation is. With that, I'd like to hand the call back over to Jessica for our first polling question. Jessica?
Thank you, Bob. And I'd like to also mention, I know we had some technical difficulties earlier where I was moving the slides forward, but you were not able to view them, but don't worry, we'll be sending you the slides and the recording tomorrow, so you'll be able to see all of the material. And now let's take a pause and do our first poll question. So as you know, part of our mission is to also provide you with information. And so we'd like to get a little bit of feedback from you, which topics you would be most interested in for future webinars. So let's go ahead and launch this poll. And that will really help me and my team here in Education and Outreach with future programming. So let's take a pause for a few seconds and go ahead and launch this poll and see what you want to hear from us. Would you like to hear more technical details of the requirements? Would you like to learn more about how to implement the rules? Would you like to learn more about certification? And the last two options are, do you need more information on the X12 transaction or the HL7 FIRE proposal on prior authorization? So interestingly enough, it looks like you are all interested in a lot of these options, which is great. So right now it's looking like the technical webinar, implementation, and then those last two transaction webinars are topics that you're interested in. So this is very helpful. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and not share because this is really information for us to plan future webinars. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I will send it back to Bob to walk through next steps.
Great, thanks, Jessica. On the next slide, you'll see that we do have some very key next steps that we want to make sure that the industry is aware of, and also look for your participation. We have started a number of different projects this year and going into next year. Again, we want to make sure that you're aware of those. We also want to advocate for entities that would like to become core certified for phase 4 and phase 5 to start your planning efforts now. We have many tools available and more tools will be coming out, particularly for phase 5. Again, I mentioned the analysis and planning guide. Those will be coming out shortly in the month of June. Also, our phase 5 FAQs will be posted to the website. So again, all these resources are available for free on our website. Again, it will include everything that entities need to ensure that their systems applications can go through, successfully go through core certification testing. We've also started our prioritization requirements development for our phase 4 response time task group. And we are also launching a number of potential pilot projects this year as well. So again, we are looking for this particular phase 4 update to minimize the time frame for final determination. Right now, the requirements are kind of broad, and we want to make sure, is there an industry appetite to come to more conclusive agreement and consensus-based approach to finalizing that final determination time frame. Is it 48 hours? Is it 2 weeks? Where should the industry land? We also want to look at how attachments are part of this process. Often they are for prior authorization. We've launched a number of things. You may have seen our recent white paper and attachments that we just published a few weeks ago, and how that will impact prior authorization, as we know it will. If we go to the next slide, we do want to give you just a little more update on our task group. Again, we just launched, we just had our first meeting here in May. And the objective is to look at the specific requirements in our current infrastructure rule around that response time. We understand that there are specific requirements that vary throughout the industry. Some states have regulation around them, Medicaids have other requirements, commercial plans have set up their own requirements. So it's really difficult for providers to understand what those requirements are if they bill or work with a number of different types of plans and members, and they service those types of members that are all having different types of insurance products, from commercials, Medicare Advantage to Medicare to Medicaid. It's quite a burden for providers. So we're having these types of conversations in this task group. Again, we're looking to see what we can do here. So we're just launched this task group. So if anyone is interested, please let us know. We are looking for participants that are subject matter experts with knowledge on this type of information. Again, if you are neck deep in prior authorizations and these types of requirements, your voice will be really important for that discussion. And we're really looking for folks to come up, participate, and help us understand not only the base requirements, but where can we go as an industry, and what do we need to know to understand these components. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we do have also a prior authorization pilot project that's going on. Again, with our vision here is to rapidly develop and actually test and track different mechanisms for prior authorization. Again, it could be different components of the prior authorization process, like is this particular service or code or value or drug require a PA or not, to a full-blown automated prior authorization, fully adjudicated process, right? From everything within this, everything is kind of within scope. We're looking at partnering both providers and health plans and vendors together to ensure that we can have a kind of a robust test, a robust pilot, different components of that process, and we're ensuring that we can actually look at both the technology requirements, the business process requirements. You can see here connectivity and security, right? There's lots of different things that could be part of the pilot. We're also probably looking for very specific use cases. Many of these exist today. Many of these are parsed out at providers' offices today between cardiology, oncology, imaging. And we can run and fast track some of these for our pilot because these processes are kind of well known today. Again, they are very manually driven. Is there a way to add technology in here in a way that we can track and trend and see if there's not some sort of ROI that industry can latch on to for building up the applications, the systems, the data content that help drive a better process for PA. We do have on the next slide kind of our vision for what some of this pilot can look like, just to give you an idea. We understand that there are various systems that are all part of this process. Some of that integration is still lacking, but is taking place today, right? And some of this is kind of building momentum between a PMS or a clinical system into the EHR. How do providers inquire about the data that the payer actually has in their system? Does a particular service require a PA? How do you request the PA? What type of data is part of your PA inquiry? What type of data comes out in your inquiry response? Is there additional data that's required? Is that data that could be encapsulated perhaps in an API to send back to the health plan, or is it really an attachment, a piece of discrete documentation that has to be sent in? All those different mechanisms that are currently part of the PA process today can be part of our pilot project. Again, if you're using an IVR system to an API to a PDF, all those different types of standards, all those mechanisms for exchange, those are things that were right for a pilot. And we think that the industry can really benefit from some leadership in this area. And again, we're looking for the industry leaders to come together and really work on a pilot with us, and we can help facilitate much of the ROI discussion and much of that connection. Again, linking up those interested parties to help facilitate a program that can help, again, really drive the industry towards some uniform and consistency in approaches and learnings that the rest of the industry can perhaps gain from. With that, I'd like to hand the call back over to Jessica for our next polling question.
Thank you, Bob. So as Bob just walked through some efforts that we are currently undertaking where we would like to see whether you'd like to join us on them. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the second poll. So if you'd like to, work with us on the prior authorization response time task group, some of our pilot works, or also we're looking for beta testers for phase 5 core certification, feel free to answer the poll. And we won't share this with this group, but we'll follow up with you after the fact, because our work is only as robust, the more people collaborate with us. But I will say there's one of these options is the winner, and I'll keep you in suspense which one that is. So with that, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and then we'll move on to our Q&A section. So we do have a few minutes for Q&A. If you'd like to submit your question, please go ahead and do so now. Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. You still have more valuable resources to share with us. So let me give you a few moments to talk about that.
No worries. I think that some of the questions that we've already received in are really related to our implementation resources. So we'll kind of tackle some of those questions now. On the next slide, you'll see that, and I mentioned this before, that we do have a website that's dedicated to phase 5. So it does include the operating rules. It will include all of the resources that are specific to this phase, to each of these operating rules. So it will include our analysis and planning guide. It'll have a link to our FAQs. It will have our tutorial on it. It will have the certification test suite. It has everything you need to really come to really understand what the requirements are, what the resources are around to support certification, and what you can do to actually participate in some of our other efforts, both with the phase 4 update as well as with our pilots. So again, just lots of information available. We want to make sure that you're aware of them. And these are all the links. These are, when you get the slide deck tomorrow, the next day, all these links will be live and active, and you'll be able to go directly to this information. So again, it's a great resource for the industry to kind of come together again for prior authorization in the work that we've done so far today.
Okay, so now we're ready for Q&A, and I'll also mention we're going to be adding more and more resources to that page, right, Bob? So people should keep coming back and seeing what goodies we have for them on phase 5. So let's get started with our Q&A. So the first question is, is phase 5 voluntary or required under current federal law? Bob, do you think you'd be willing to take that one?
Yep, it's a great question. I'll tackle that one. Right now, we've just published the operating rules for the industry through our voluntary approach. So the core participants came together from the findings from our environmental scan, went through the advisory group and our subgroups and work groups. And we've just published the rules this month. So our next step in the process is to consider taking these to the various government agencies in the process that exists for pushing things through that regulatory process. We are having those discussions. We will probably be taking parts of these rules, particularly the data content rule for the 278 transaction, right? It is transaction specific. It's the mandated HIPAA transaction that's already mandated for the PA process. We're layering on these operating rules to this transaction, just like we've done for eligibility and claim status and the 835, the remittance advice transaction, and the EFT transaction in our previous phases. Those are all mandated to be implemented by HHS and regulatory process. Those rules went through that process previously. We anticipate to propose these rules also go through that process. So as of today, even projecting out to June 1st of this year, they are only voluntary for the industry to adopt. Any sort of regulatory process that they go through for mandate, we will keep the industry abreast of the status of that and as they go through that process. So as of today, They are voluntary. Again, I do want to kind of highlight here that nearly 90% of the core participants that voted for this rule set, they voted in support of them. We'll be tracking our core participants through certification testing and becoming alpha and beta testers, and we'll be keeping the industry abreast of what's going on as they voluntarily adopt the operating rules. But again, today they're voluntary. Who knows what the future might bring? We would like to go forward and have these proposed for federal mandate, but they are voluntary today.
Great, Bob. So we received several questions that all fall kind of in the same category of, how do efforts such as Da Vinci and FIRE fall into the work we're doing with the Phase 5 operating rules and the pilots. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a lot of interest in other mechanisms for data exchange, as well as other standards for different components of the PA process. Again, the PA process is robust in the industry. There's many components to it, and the 278 transaction is specific to a request for a PA, a request for prior authorization for a particular service. Other types or other components of that process is a PA required for this service. Those types of standards don't exist today, but the industry is building out those standards, like a FIRE transaction, like different types of connectivity, like a direct message through email, perhaps, right? So there's all these different ways that health plans and providers are communicating and exchanging data today, as well as the way that they've been doing it for a while now, right? EDI has been a part of our process, from SFTP, right, to a FIRE data exchange. It's all kind of leading to a continued industry discussion around what are the best methods for exchanging data. We at CAQH CORE, we're always looking at where the industry is at today, what steps it needs to take to get to the best process tomorrow. That's both with connectivity, security, data content, business process, model, right? We're always looking for ROI, what's best for the industry. So all of these different components are at play today, particularly with prior authorization, because it is such a broad mechanism and the exchange for data is so robust. So we're looking at all of those different components, both with our pilots as well as with any future operating rule requirements. Connectivity is only one component of that process. Security is only one component of that process. Data content is only one component of that process. So operating rules kind of address many of those components at once to drive towards more efficiency. So that's why operating rules can be having the discussion with a FIRE, with a PDF, with a digital certificate, because each of those are just single independent components of a process. And we're looking at the entire robust process for PA, and operating rules can apply in that environment in a variety of ways. So that's why we convene our core participants, and it's a very broad set. We need that broad set of participants to have those discussions and find out, here's where the industry's at today, where do we need to go tomorrow? How do we build the best highway to get there, along with the best data content? And many standards only fill either they're a fire hose or so much it's too big for providers or too big for health plans, or it's too narrow and we have to adjust and accommodate and fill in particular gaps with that data or with the standards around connectivity or around security, right? There's lots of debate and discussion. So that's what we are here for. We're here to help lead the industry in those types of discussions.
That's really helpful, Bob. And I think what I'm hearing you say is even if HHS adopted FIRE as a standard, we still need operating rules.
Definitely
right?
Correct. Yep.
That's great. So there were a couple of questions, people interested in joining some of these efforts with us, and we'll contact you. We've got you. If you responded to the polling question or if you submitted a question, we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards. Thank you. And then we had several questions, Bob, regarding, how this applies to dental. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, dental is another use case that is very unique, right? Dentists often use the claim transaction, the 837 predetermination for service validation, right? Is the service covered? How much would it cost the patient for the service? They can actually use the claim transaction for that, and many health plans support that type of transaction. Other dental health plans do require a true prior authorization. So those are often today conducted on a web portal or through an IVR system or a fax or an email. Some health plans do conduct the 278. I think they're very far and few between. Please reach out and let us know. We definitely need more industry input for the dental market. But the operating rules are specific to the HIPAA-covered transactions. So if the health plan is conducting that transaction, then the operating rules apply. I would advocate that HIPAA does require the use of the 278 for any prior authorization. So if a provider wishes to submit the 278 for a prior authorization, then the health plan has to accommodate that transaction. That's my interpretation of HIPAA. And so if the if a provider does wish to conduct an automated 278 transaction, then any health plan, whether it's dental, medical, commercial, Medicare, Medicaid, they would have to conduct the 278 transaction. We understand that many health plans have put portals in between the provider and the health plan to help accommodate a more automated approach, right? It's better than picking up the phone or sending in a fax with a fax cover sheet that the provider's printed off, right? We're still in 1980s technology in much of this process. We're trying to pull the industry forward with a more automated, truly EDI-based process for prior authorization that's using the HIPAA standard transactions that are mandated for this process. So I know there's a long-winded response, but there's many ways that the industry can adopt the standard and implement resources and adjudication processes that can simplify this process to help reduce phone and fax that is really driving PA process today.
Thank you so much, Bob. So I know that we shared a lot of information with you. If you do have additional questions, not today, but in the future, please contact us, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. On this next slide, you'll see our future webinars, and also we'll be at HFMA at the end of June talking about prior authorization at a workshop the Sunday before the conference, so hope to see you there. And finally, these are ways to connect with us, either on our website or via email. I'd like to thank our speakers, Noam and Rhonda and Bob, for being with us here today, and thank our audience for joining us. I hope you have a great afternoon.